Alrighty, why don't we get moving? I'm Kalila Harris. I'm the Managing Director of K-12 Education Policy at the Center for American Progress. If you are not sure where you are, again, we're in the Redesigning Public Education as we emerge from the pandemic session here at EduPalooza. Just want to talk with you about some housekeeping and give you an overview of the session. The session is going to discuss how we expect many students who are returning to in-person learning from long absences or who have returned, gone back home, and maybe returning again, have experienced some learning slide as well as trauma and hardship, either as a direct or secondary result of the pandemic and long-term isolation. The panel will feature 2 educators participating in the We Build EDU Storytellers campaign to amplify the voices of Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other non-Black people of color who are educators, who will discuss what needs to happen to make schools better and more equitable for students in a post-pandemic world, as soon as we get to a post-pandemic world. The panel will also include arguments for strategic investments targeted to communities hardest hit economically and by the pandemic itself. We will also have my colleague Neil Campbell, who works with me at the Center for American Progress, and Jessica Cardichon from the Learning Policy Institute. And we will be discussing requests for education stabilization and stimulus funding that CAP has been promoting and making with partners across the field from local, state, and federal advocacy organizations. And to create an opportunity and counseling core to help both students and young adults have access to work in this recession resulting from job loss or job uncertainty in the pandemic. So why don't we get started? I'm going to give the panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves and ask them to speak to just one thing that has been a bright spot in the pandemic. I've been saying to lots of my friends and family, 2020 feels harsh. However, for me, it feels like the universe is clearing some things out so we can be better in 2021. So I'd love to hear from each of you just a little bit about a bright spot during this time. And I am going to start with you, Chinea. Please introduce yourself and tell us one thing that has been positive for you at this time of uncertainty.
Thank you, Kalila. I'm Shanae Bond. I am a secondary educator of English and literacy in Fort Worth, Texas. And one of the things that's been a bright spot for me, I'm an English teacher and I have an education degree and I write so little, just in general. So this particular time has made it super important that I write things down. I'm documenting, writing letters to my toddler and writing letters to keep in communication with my students and their families. So just the opportunity to sit down and work on my penmanship has been pretty cool and unexpected.
I love that. Certainly, being in a schoolhouse for 10 years myself, I know that when you're in the building, the idea of actually sitting down for a moment is foreign. So totally appreciate that. Thank you. Jessica, I'm going to pitch to you. Introduce yourself and tell us what you're working on and one bright spot.
Great, thanks. And thank you for this opportunity. Looking forward to the conversation. My name is Jessica Cardichon, and I work for the Learning Policy Institute. We are a research and policy organization focused on the students who are furthest from opportunity. And I lead our DC office and our K-12 federal policy work. One bright spot is I found before the pandemic, often we would ask people, oh, how are you doing? And they'd say, okay, and then you'd move on to the conversation that people kind of sit a little bit longer with, how are you doing? And kind of sharing a bit more and connecting. And that's something I hope we don't lose after this, of just really checking in on how our colleagues, our friends are doing moving forward. So.
Awesome. Thank you. Definitely heard some interesting responses to how are you doing. And my favorite one so far has been I'm navigating, which we all are trying to do our best at. Sam, let me get you in here. Samuel Buckley is an assistant principal in Baltimore County Schools. Why don't you introduce yourself, tell us what you're focused on and a bright spot.
Okay, awesome. And thank you, Kalila, for giving me this platform. So my name is Samuel Buckley. I am assistant principal in Baltimore County Schools. This is my 5th year in administration. I've been in education for about 14 years. One huge bright spot for me as an administrator is the ability to go into classrooms for instructional observations. These are and talking about informal observations on a more frequent basis, whereas I'm able to give back meaningful feedback to our teachers. So that's something that I've been able to do frequently now because we're not necessarily in the schoolhouse. So a lot of the managerial tasks that I'm tasked with on a daily basis, like discipline or whatever the case may be, it's just not relevant at the moment. So I've been loving the opportunity to go into the classrooms and coach teachers up, give them meaningful feedback. So that's one thing that I really am excited about.
Thanks, Sam. It's so interesting the things that, we took for granted prior to the pandemic, and the things, frankly, we complained about prior to the pandemic, that the pandemic has allowed for us to zoom in on and really hone our craft in the same way Chanae is able to do more writing, in the same way Jessica talked about really sitting with, hearing and listening to people about how they're doing, your ability to actually pay attention a little bit more to what's happening with instruction is really a gift. Neil, I'm going to pitch to you. I talk to you several times a week, but I would love to hear a bright spot and tell the folks what you're working on.
Yeah, thank you, Kalila, and thanks to everyone at Excel and Ed for putting this together and sharing so many perspectives during what is a very different sort of summit and Palooza experience than the past. So I am a director on the education policy team at CAP. And, in a regular year, my time would be much more focused on things like charter school policy and high school redesign. This year being different for so many has involved a lot of time thinking about, responding to and recovering from the pandemic and its effects on kids and schools and communities. And so it's been I felt it's been a great opportunity to get to do that, and hopefully that we'll be able to see more investments like the kind of start we had with the CARES Act in the new year to really help the education systems recover. And the kind of bright spot, so this year is the first year for my boys in public education in preschool, and so my coffee breaks this year have involved getting to sit in on their 30-minute circle time in the morning and hear their excitement and the wonderful thing their teachers are doing. And their school mascot is the Otters, and the Otter puns and song lyrics are incredible. And, I find myself singing "The Otters Come to School" more often than I would like to admit in my open office space.
First of all, we all should have circle time in the morning to sing "The Otters Come to School." It would probably make everyone's day so much brighter. Thank you, Neil. I appreciate it. And thank you, everyone. Just as a matter of housekeeping, I want to make sure everyone's aware that at the end of towards the end of the session, we will be taking questions from the audience. If you will just place them in the question and answer box, we will make sure we get to questions that were not really asked and answered. But please feel free throughout to drop your questions there, and our support team from StreamPoint and Excel and Ed will make sure those questions are filtered forward. So let's move into the meat of the discussion. CAP has partnered with EduColor on a storytelling campaign called We Build EDU. You can find information about We Build EDU at webuildedu.org. We are looking for stories of educators who are Black, Indigenous, and other non-Black people of color. And we are describing educators as anyone who supports a child's development from the time they leave their home in the morning until the time they make their way home in the evening. So that's our bus drivers, office managers, guidance counselors, custodian, of course, our teachers and our school leaders, but everyone who plays a role in the development of our children all have a voice in what's happening right now and should be able to amplify their voices to elected officials. And they also have a clear voice on how their students are being impacted in the face of very deep racial tensions that we experienced this year, surfacing things that were under the surface up until this point that people in many ways turned a blind eye to, in addition to having true insight into what schools should look like to provide a quality education for every child who is in an American public school. And the last piece being most critical, we know the majority of students attending American public schools are Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other non-Black children of color, but the teaching and school leadership workforce doesn't reflect that population. Further, we know that the education sector has been the industry that has taken the largest hit in terms of people losing their roles. And many of those people are people who have jobs that have lower incomes than you'd think an administrator or in some places a school teacher would have. And so we want to hear those stories about how they're being impacted. If you know an educator who is by POC, please invite them to check out We Build EDU to share their story. If you are not an educator, please read the stories. Please understand what's going on in our schools. You'll hear more about that today during this discussion. The last piece is on the website. We have a call to action. You can make sure that the stories of these educators go to your elected officials at the State House level and in Congress. So you are able to fill out a call to action and it'll go directly to your elected officials, asking them to visit the site and hear directly from constituents in their communities about how their experience education through this pandemic and the secondary pandemic, if not primary in this country, of racial injustice. So Chene, I want to start with you. Will you talk about what you're experiencing right now? Are you in person? Are you remote 100%? Is there a hybrid? What do you see happening in your setting as it relates to the pandemic and how educators and families and students are coping?
Thank you. I just want to say really quick about We Build EDU. It's an incredible resource. And I also did not know when I filmed that video this summer that it would lead to this opportunity. And I think I was a little indignant when I was like, I can't believe this is happening. So thank you for inviting me here. My district right now is a mixture of in-person and virtual learning. We have made that the district has made the decision that they are going to push for more students to be in person. So at this point in time, at the secondary level, half the students who want to be in person go half the time, and the other half go the other half of the week. But after Christmas, it'll be all students who want to be in person are there all 5 days. And so, yeah, it's been an extremely interesting experience telling parents your kid that only comes to school Monday or Tuesday or only Wednesday and Thursday, sometimes Friday. So hopefully some of those things will be remedied when those students start coming in person consistently, more like normal times.
Thank you for that. And I want to surface something else that, which is, We Build EDU builds on the critical race practice of having people tell their stories in their own voices and not be filtered through other people. So thank you for sharing your story. It is important for people not to have so-called policy experts, researchers, or whomever filter their voices and be able to share directly and passionately about their experiences. I do want to follow up with you and ask, has there been any conversation on the ground where you are about changing the idea of students returning in the spring in light of how rapidly the virus is spreading?
No, absolutely not. It's happening in teacher circles. Obviously, we're attempting to advocate for ourselves and for our students. But in terms of our district and state leadership, we are in the great state of Texas. And despite all medical evidence to the contrary, we are moving forward not only with students returning in mass, but also with our standardized testing. Our standardized testing schedule has not changed or been amended. So I think that in order to, because at the high school level, if you don't pass, these standardized tests, then you can't graduate. So in order to accommodate those needs that students are going to have to be able to get a diploma at this point, I think our district is kind of feeling the heat to have to bring them back because we're losing so many students to virtual learning or hybrid and all of the confusion. So no, we are taking the virus less seriously in terms of the decision making and taking standardized testing and the impact that that'll have on students more seriously.
Thank you. I'm going to circle back to you on that, particularly as it relates to students trying to access college and not necessarily having the access they need to their support systems in schools. Sam, I want to pivot to you. Will you talk a little bit about what's happening in your context and what you're seeing with families from the perspective of an administrator?
On offering grace and empathy to our educators and for our families. For our students, we purposely built in that whole social emotional learning aspect in the day. So in my particular school, we have it in the morning. And it's been really great. We've been able to just check in and get a pulse for our students and our teachers. So that's been absolutely amazing. For some of our unengaged students, administrators and PPWs, right now we're sitting at about 95% attendance for our school. And we've been very intentional with doing home visits, doing virtual check-ins with parents, and with everything being virtual, the great thing is that a lot of our parents, they have smartphones, so we're able to send them links to Google Meets and things like that, and it's great to have that interaction. And so that the parent communication has actually been better during this virtual learning. Which is really, really great. I think that one thing that's very important, just from an administrative standpoint, is just to make sure that our educators are in a good headspace. And like Neil had stated earlier, a lot of our educators, they have school-age kids at home, so they are trying to juggle their professional responsibilities with their personal responsibilities. So it is a juggling act. But as administrators, I know on a daily basis, I always say, hey, I'm in it with you. So if there's a teacher and, sometimes we might struggle getting a substitute in, and if there's a teacher that, needs to take some time off, me personally, I'll jump in and I'll be the teacher for the day. But so it's very important that we are being flexible with all of our practices. And I think as far as the parental, I think parents are actually seeing how valuable educators are in this pandemic. And I think that if we want to, a lot of times, I did a home visit a few weeks ago, and the parent said, you know what, Mr. Buckley, I'm not that tech savvy. So sometimes, my student hasn't been able to log in because she doesn't know exactly what she's doing, or and I don't know exactly what I'm doing. So I think just given that some tech literacy resources and opportunities for them to get on, I think that's very, very important. But the most important thing that we have to have is that empathy. And right now, our district is everyone's virtual. I think as numbers have spiked up, we were going to have some outdoor practices for high school athletics, but that is even, on hold for the moment. So I think safety is always priority when it comes to education. And I think the superintendent has done a great job with kind of holding back on having in-person instruction for right now.
Thank you, Sam. And it's funny because I saw Chinea have a little smirk on some of the things that you some of the things that you laid out. And frankly, it is not the same across the country, which is why we build EDU. We have people taking very different approaches and having very different mindsets as it relates to supporting educators. I do want to stick with you for a little bit. Will you talk about the support staff in your school? Cafeteria workers, custodian, office manager, how are those folks being impacted? In your district, are you seeing people being laid off, or are you hearing about this in neighboring districts?
No, so we haven't necessarily had the layoffs. I think everyone is operating on like a rotational schedule. So our office personnel, they're rotating days in and out. So some days some will be on, and then the others will be home working on clerical things and fielding phone calls and things like that. Our custodial staff, we actually have six, and we rotate. So two are in the building, and they're on like 8-hour shifts. The cafeteria staff, they're actually in 3 times a week because we are still distributing meals to the community for those who are in need. So they're in 3 times a week. So everything is kind of going according to plan, but everything is on a rotational schedule. Even administrators at my particular school, we have 3 assistant principals and 1 principal. We're even rotating. So there's 1 administrator in the building at any given time, especially when clerical and custodians are in the building.
Great, thank you. And you actually gave us a clean pitch to discuss the Counseling and Opportunity Corps when you surface parents also needing assistance with technology. But we're going to hold on that. I'm going to start first with Jessica. And Jessica, will you, we don't know what's going to happen next, right? If we had a crystal ball, I'd say, what do you think will need to be our top priorities for education as we emerge from the pandemic? And what should we be doing now to prepare for the next school year?
Great. And, I think when I was thinking about this question is like, what do we know now? I think, and it's been really helpful to hear from the voices of practitioners, of teachers and school leaders, and they know kind of what's ahead. And the biggest one is addressing lost instructional time and being mindful of also how we talk about students. I often hear the phrase learning loss, and I worry about us looking at our students from a deficit perspective as they return. And I think preparing our teachers and schools to be structured in ways that are welcoming and inclusive when students come back, and look at really kind of diagnose or assess what their needs are. But again, not looking at them from a deficit perspective, but what opportunities have they missed out on or had inconsistent access to, and how do we meet those needs in ways where we don't contribute to remediation or tracking or ways that narrow student opportunities. I think that's the thing that I worry about most, is that we take the joy out of learning. We don't think about students' access to a well-rounded education, also coming from a lot of isolation, stress at home, that we tend to the academic needs as well as the social emotional needs in furtherance of those academic needs. And also thinking about the well-being of our educators. I know it's one of those things we want to make sure at the forefront that our school leaders and teachers and staff, this has been emotional and exhausting for them too, that we are positioning schools well to give them the supports and resources that they need. The other thing when I look ahead is I worry about the cuts to education budgets and who they disproportionately impact. And we know they're coming. And so what are states doing and what are community members doing to try and put pressure on states to really protect education investments, and also where cuts have to be made to make sure that they don't fall on the communities of concentrated poverty or students furthest from opportunity. And then finally, and Kalila, as you framed beginning, students are coming back not only from COVID, but the racial injustice that has been at the forefront, but longstanding. And we know that COVID has had a disproportionate impact on communities of color and families. And making sure that the schools that they return to think about how they provide instructional strategies differently. That if you weren't a school that was looking at culturally responsive practices before, if you weren't thinking about teacher preparation or teacher professional development and the curriculum that you're using in your discipline policies through that lens beforehand, that this is a chance to really restart and re-examine those policies as students come back in.
Perfect, Jessica. That is exactly right. And I am in a persistent state of encouraging, if not admonishing, educators on several fronts. First and foremost, I think that I do not appreciate the term learning loss because it does approach children from a deficit standpoint, and typically children who are attending schools that are predominantly non-white or families have lower resources, those students end up in double blocks of math, double blocks of reading, losing recess, losing art. And we don't want to see that happen because we know that is not the best framework to prepare students to do higher order thinking and to be critical thinkers. So 100% agree on that front. And then your last point around racial injustice, a big part of We Build EDU is making sure that we have educators be able to speak directly to the gaps in educational opportunities our students have, both to not only see themselves and their cultures in the curriculum, but have educators and school leaders who are prepared to create environments where they both assess their own contribution to participating in practices that support white supremacy, that support them having the skill set of creating anti-racist school environments, that support them making clear to teachers, that you cannot be highly qualified if you're not taking a culturally responsive, culturally affirming, culturally sustaining approach to pedagogy and the way you teach. And that is not code word for windows and mirrors and making sure the Black and brown children see themselves in a storybook. It is also for your blonde-haired, blue-eyed white kids in Appalachia who are experiencing lack of broadband, deep poverty, and having educators come to them who respect their families, who don't start railing about coal mines and cutting down trees when all of the kids' parents are loggers and work in the coal mines. So culturally responsive practice, unfortunately, some people see it as a pejorative or see it as a nice to have instead of a must have. And it is important that all schools and all educators, if they're worth their salt, are taking that second look. Neil, I want to pivot to you here to talk about the Counseling and Opportunity Corps and to really share just a bit more about how policy can address the areas of short and long-term needs that we've heard from Shania, Sam, and Jessica, and what policymakers and advocates should be focused on right now as the new Congress and administration will be starting in January.
Yeah, thanks so much, and happy to build on what everyone was just going through, and as I've been talking a lot about the types of needs that are out there for education systems this year, I've really delineated three separate ways. One is responding to the pandemic. So all the things about making sure there's equitable access to, the kids have devices, that they have internet access, that teachers are getting training to kind of upend their practice that they've learned and, experienced for, years or decades. Things like ventilation in schools. Those are all critically important. There's a lot of folks working hard on them. They don't necessarily have all the resources needed to do it, and we still have a ways to go there. The second is stabilizing resources. That the economic uncertainty going on is going to hit, state income and sales taxes, and it's going to make things even tougher. And so if we're having mid-year layoffs this year or we're borrowing, getting creative with funding to borrow from next year and running into problems next year, we're going to make things even harder, and you're going to make the burden on administrators at the district, state, and then school administrators even harder to have to figure out how to, protect what they can and, keep a stable workforce or rebuild a workforce if there are mid-year cuts and then something changes in the fall. So those are both critically important, both things that Congress and the new administration need to be working on. But the third is this idea of recovery. There is so much lost time. There are the social isolation, the lack of supports, the students with disabilities who have not been getting the services that they need. And then the trauma that kids are experiencing, and that is concentrated and amplifying, as folks were alluding to, the inequities that already exist. And so the needs that children have are going to be significant. And that doesn't, I don't want to have it from a sort of deficit lens either, but there needs to be supports for kids to address the traumas that they've had and to make up for the lost time that they've experienced. And so the kind of big idea that we put out a couple of months ago is creating this opportunity and counseling core. And so the idea there is to invest billions in the communities most severely affected by the pandemic. So communities that have seen very high, rates of job losses, that have seen, higher incidence of the disease, higher mortality and in illness counts. And so the opportunity part of that would be, billions of dollars to invest creating good jobs for young adults and community members, so folks in their own communities, to support children in school. So they would be acting as things like tutors, increasing the size of teacher residencies, that they could, have other roles in schools, maybe offering the tech support to families and their younger classmates in an expanded way to really help children, access the learning that they need and the support that they need. And, things like tutoring and teacher residencies, there are strong evidentiary basis for that as, ways that we can help kids, make up for all that they lost during this time. The second part of it is considering the trauma that so many kids have been experiencing this year. So it is investing in a counseling core. We know that there's also strong evidentiary base around access to school counselors, access to school social workers and psychologists, having positive impacts on attendance, on on-time graduation, and things like that. And then we also know that the students most in need, who are very highly likely to be the ones most affected by the pandemic, are those who have the least access to counselors and social workers in school. And so targeted investments to make sure that those communities can address the needs of students, can connect them with other social services outside of schools, can really help children deal with how painful this year has been, if they've had family members that they've lost, or that they've experienced, housing and food and economic uncertainty in their families. It's just so important. And it's a, it's not an easy instant fix. There's not the same kind of workforce out there to instantly do that. But I think it's important to make sure that the schools that need that most have the money available to invest in the counseling supports.
Thank you, Neil. Another reason we need the counselors in particular is, students have not necessarily had that same access to drop in and knock on the counselor's door, knock on the school psychologist's door and just say, I need you today. I need that help. And the adults in our schools have the kind of relationships where you can look at a kid coming in Monday morning and say, okay, they're going to need some help this week coping with whatever's happening at home, in community, or personally, if they're trying to do identity development, or if they're experiencing relational issues with other classmates, but that has been wiped away from a lot of students. We also know there are hundreds of thousands of children who have not returned to school, have not logged into anything, have not taken up on the offer for hybrid, picked up a device to use. And some people are saying, oh, those children are in learning pods, or their parents are homeschooling them. And that is highly unlikely because for the most part, children who have families who are taking up that level of investment, their families are more likely to communicate with their previous school that they are homeschooling them. And so we're going to have an influx of students who possibly have been out of school for a year or more, returning once we have stabilized the pandemic. I'd be remiss to not acknowledge that I live on unsurrendered land of the Lenape and Susquehannock people in the state of Maryland. And in Maryland, we had 60 deaths reported yesterday, our highest number of the entire pandemic. And so dealing with the loss that our children and our educators are experiencing is going to be critical with that counseling core. And from the opportunity core side of it, having class sizes reduced and having job opportunity, frankly, for recent high school graduates and college graduates to maintain their skills or develop skills is going to be critical in the recovery. So I want to open up a question for all of you. Even before the pandemic, school wasn't working for many students. We've said that throughout this discussion. What would you like to see change after the pandemic to make schools more equitable and to ensure quality of education for every child? And I'm going to first start with you, Chinea, and then invite anyone else to respond if they would like to.
I've been taking notes on everything. Something that has hit me extremely hard. I mean, even as a Black woman and as a Black former student, right, that this focus on culturally responsive teaching and culturally responsive education kind of got pushed to the side when it became clear that COVID was not going to ease up over the summer. And so obviously, I think that we need teacher prep programs that and administrators in districts that support that. But something else that's been really intensified during this pandemic is that not only does school not work for a great deal of our students, but it's not set up to. I have several students who have taken on the role of breadwinner in their homes, and so going to school from 8 to 3:30 has never really worked for them, but they showed up occasionally for truancy, to not have a parent go to jail. And those students, now that there's been an opportunity for them to kind of occasionally pop in, are doing so, but they're not learning anything. And so building an education system that is working for those students. I mean, I don't think that we even think about, I work in a secondary building. We don't think about kids who are working 12 to 13, 14-hour days to put food on the table. And there's no space for them. There's no space for those students to do their job and to learn, and they have to pick. And so the biggest thing that I would, if I could do anything, is figure out a way for schools to address the needs of those students who we don't even see on the daily, because those kids are part of the great deal that have fallen off and may never come back. And so when we're talking about recovery, we have to address the students who left and they're not going to come back with the year of lost education. They're not going to come back at all. And how do we make space for them and their very specific needs when it comes to food insecurity and job insecurity and housing insecurity? How do we ensure that those students who have to work in order to provide for their families because of things that were happening pre-pandemic, how do we ensure that school works for them? It's not. And that's been something that's been weighing on me pretty heavily, and hearing all of everyone's responses. School doesn't work for so many students who are in adult roles, and how do we fix that?
Thanks, Chinea. I mean, school doesn't work for children who aren't in adult roles, right? We have extremely intelligent young people who aren't getting access to deeply rigorous and advanced education because of the structure of schools and the structure of using single exams to determine whether or not you have access to magnet programs or advanced programs. You have children who are in environments where they have 35 children in a classroom and one educator. So there are so many things that, we need to upend, that it's going to be critical that we take a pause. We use this time to really reconsider what schools should look like. Sam, did you want to contribute there in terms of how we modify the structure of schools?
Yeah, and I was thinking about, as Shania was talking, and I was thinking about for those students who virtual learning is actually working for them. And I was thinking about, students that now they're much more engaged, because, some students, now that some of them, they don't have to necessarily cut their camera on like we encourage them to, but, they do so much. It's like that anxiety is away. So I was thinking about that. And then I was thinking about education is not a one size fits all thing, and I think oftentimes, I was thinking about those students who have been excelling, but then I think about the students on the flip side, our ESOL students or our special education students who actually, some of them thrive better when they're in the actual school building. And it's like now they don't necessarily have those one-on-ones, who are right there with them, and they're really struggling. Then to think about just a learning environment in general. You think about the schoolhouse, and it's kind of this kind of controlled setting, and everyone. It would be in a perfect world at home. You want students to wake up and they're able to have a desk in their room or have a spare room to go into, and there's not a lot of noise. I mean, they can just focus on their education. But then you think about that's not the ideal situation. Some students, they might have to take care of a little brother or a little sister. It's a lot of things going on in the household. They can't really focus. So like my biggest thing is like the learn environment, it's not the same, amongst, across the board. And then when we think about technology, and I know a lot of school districts, I mean, at the last minute, like we struggle. Luckily, like my district was a one-to-one district already prior, but I think about the districts who were not, and scrambling around trying to get devices, and then what if that in the home they didn't have the internet, so now we're scrambling around trying to get hotspots. So that whole technology piece, I mean, we talk about equity. I think this pandemic has really shown the disparity as far as technology access. And some parents, they have the financial means to go out and purchase another laptop, and not depend on a district-wide laptop, but some just don't. But I think the one good thing is that now those students who didn't have access to technology, now they actually have it, which is a good thing. But more importantly, I think when we talk about like moving forward, and I think Kalila, you addressed it before with the the racial injustice that was going on. I know at my school we purposely, when things were occurring, I think that it's one thing to have trainings and things like that in reference to diversity and things like that, but I think that it's equally important to actually put it into practice, when it's meaningful. So giving students the opportunity to have conversations about racial injustice and how it's impacting their community, and let the students utilize their voices. And I think oftentimes we always talk about we want kids to be critical thinkers and we want them to be prepare for the real world, but we actually have to give them the platform to actually utilize their voice. And because of what's going on right now, I mean, this is history. So it's very important for me to not miss these learning opportunities, when for students to utilize their voice. And I think every administrator, every school district should actually give students the opportunities to utilize their voice and talk about things that are really occurring in the real world. Yeah.
Jessica and Neil, I want to give you an opportunity as well if you'd like to contribute on this question.
Yeah, I think, quickly, I was thinking also, you're right, many schools were not working for many students. But what are lessons to be learned from those that were working well? So for example, LPI has done a lot of work around community schools, as have another number of other organizations. Many community schools have been really particularly well positioned during COVID and will be well positioned post-COVID to meet the needs of students. Not every school has to be a community school, but what are their lessons to be learned from that approach to education? The other piece is states that have had more equitable school funding formulas have been better positioned to target resources to districts that need that. And money matters. The federal funds worked out to only about $286 per student to help them through this pandemic. And so as we think post-pandemic and beyond, we really need as a country to tackle the way that schools are funded, because there were schools that are managing to make it through this. It's not easy for any school, but there are schools and that are better resourced and have been able, to your point, navigate this better, more easily than other schools. And so we know that there'll be other things that will happen, whether particularly natural disasters, other things that will shut schools down. And how do we make sure that we're prepared, that we've learned lessons, that we lean into research-based practices, but that we also don't overlook that money really does matter and that we need to rethink how we're funding schools and targeting our resources.
Yeah, and that was actually the exact same direction I was going to go, Jessica. But I think like the part of it that strikes me is that so many elements of this year have been, and I don't know if my reversal, but have been K-shaped, of where employment effects have been K-shaped and income, in that it's so many kind of retail, service, travel and tourism, hospitality, where job losses have been concentrated. And then the effects on kids, as Shanae and Sam were talking about, of the kids with additional responsibilities or without a quiet place to work at home or device access and all of those things, versus others who have a stable place and where this may be working as well, or for some subset of kids maybe even better than being in a traditional school environment. And so it just speaks to the need to make our funding methodologies more equitable. And I hope we don't repeat some of the bad lessons from the Great Recession, of where we saw, it was the better part of a decade for funding, the real per pupil funding to get back to where it was. And when it got back, that was on the sort of macro level. There were a number of states that cut tax rates. So when, during the Great Recession, so that when federal stimulus ran out, that's when they saw the kind of cliff of funding, and it hampered getting back to where things were. And what happened is we saw local funding was what rebounded first, and we know that's the least equitable level of funding in the education sphere. And so it was the communities with the resources and abilities to raise more local funding that did so because they thought it was important. And so I hope that recovering from the pandemic, that we learn some of those lessons and don't see this sort of stagnation that we saw in many ways from the Great Recession into the 2017 and 2019 NAEP statistics that were so disappointing.
Thanks, Neil. And I'd add, at least half of the states did not get back to pre-recession funding. And so we've had these conversations about accountability and standards. At the same time, we had states, in fact, decreasing resources over time, even after their economies rebounded, and using schools as a place where they could, in many ways, shortchange their constituents for the sake of other types of economic development, which is a formula for disaster. If you have young people who are not prepared for a future workforce, are not prepared for the industries that are coming forward because their schools were working on a bare bones, and then penalized as quote unquote failing schools, even though school buildings are inanimate objects, and taking the impetus off of the adults, the people in the buildings, to modify their practice so that all students could be supported. But then when you say to them, we're not increasing your pay, we are not decreasing your class sizes, we are not providing more holistic forms of education, we are not supporting the concept of having counselors and not cops in your schools, but we still expect you to improve outcomes for children. It was a no-win situation in a lot of our communities. I want to remind everyone that if you have a question for the panel, you should please include that in hit that little button that is a question mark. We'd love to hear from you. We're coming close to the end, and we want to make sure we're able to answer any questions from those of you who are watching. If you want to share an anecdote about what's happening in your own community, we'd love to lift that up as well. But I want to find out from the rest of the panel. Are there core strategies or core conversations you feel like we are not having at this time, or conversations that we are having too much of? We hear a lot about pandemic pods, but most children are not in pandemic pods. I mean, every major newspaper is constantly reporting on pandemic pods, which most children are not a part of. So what are some of the topics that we're giving too much attention to, and others we may not be giving enough to?
I'll go quickly because I did want to follow up on your last point. I think one is on how schools are funded, and there might be a sense that, well, an economic downturn is not the time to rethink how schools are funding, but it's actually a very good time, because as you build up your economies and you think about funding, you can build up in more equitable ways. California, Maryland, Rhode Island both rethought their school finance system during periods of economic downturn. The other piece is the teacher pipeline, and that is something we are already seeing the impact of COVID on teachers, future potential teachers actually entering into the profession. College affordability has a real impact, not only on students' access to comprehensive programs, but also efforts to diversify the educator workforce as well. And so I think the idea of, we talk about supporting teachers, but teacher compensation, college affordability, all will impact the pipeline into the profession. And that's something that long-term, if we don't pay attention to it now, it'll be a long-term impact of COVID that we'll see come to fruition a couple of years from now.
Yeah, Jessica, many of you, and Shanae, I'll get to you next. Many of you may be aware that there have been extensive efforts, including from LPI and Center for American Progress and a number of other organizations, to increase the racial diversity of our teaching workforce. And the challenge has become that in light of a number of those efforts happening in recent time, you have a lot of those folk who may have joined the profession through advanced recruitment, who are the last people in, and therefore, based on collective bargaining agreements, may be the first people out if we have to do layoffs. So that is something huge. When you talk about financing, you have a number of states who are really concerned, or I should say school districts really concerned, because the drop off in the number of enrolled students may mean that their state makes a choice to decrease their maintenance of effort for funding our schools, and that can really impact the great work that's been done in a number of places to increase the racial diversity of our teaching workforce and our school leader workforce. And Shanae, I want to apologize, I haven't been saying your name correctly, but you had a thought on this as well?
Yes, going back to something Principal Buckley said, something that I think that we haven't spent enough time on are the connection between COVID and racial injustice. And I just, on a micro level, I've heard so many students say, I have been more productive at home because I don't have to deal with racist teachers. I've been more productive at home because I don't have to deal with racist practices, and I don't have to deal with racist rule enforcement. And so I think that needs to be a conversation that we have, just in terms of students who felt safer, even though they may not be learning as much, students who felt safer not having to go into school buildings. And another thing that, Tequity. Giving students devices is incredible. Ensuring that they have hotspots is incredible. But when we're looking back at this time, what are we doing with that technology? Are we allowing students to create things that are going to help them build a portfolio for college or work? Are we allowing them the opportunity to curate and create things that are stimulating and also meet their extremely diverse needs? I know that my district has put a lot of effort into making sure that students have these tangible resources, but there's been little to no training for teachers and for admin on how to ensure that students are not only given a device, but shown how to use it in a way that helps them increase job potential, helps them increase college readiness. And so ensuring that that we as educators have training on how to best prepare students for what the world is going to look like post-COVID, instructionally, but also in preparing them after school. I think these conversations should be happening way more.
Thanks, Shanae. And you raise an interesting point, because there may be children who experience great anxiety when it is time to go back, because they're going back into an environment that was not welcoming and not conducive for their learning. So how do we then deal with large numbers of students who have now had an extended time to step away from those environments and are now being told it's time to go back? We are coming to a close. We have a question from Joseph Nathan. Thank you, Joseph, for the question. And he talks about the great work of Mary Catherine Ricker in the Minnesota Department of Education, who gathered educators who are doing really well in terms of online instruction. And that would be something I know has not been, we haven't done a good job of having conversations on how to do online instruction really well. And Joseph says that the commissioner has gathered those folk and encouraged and supported them, hopefully financially as well, in doing professional development for their colleagues on online instruction. Just really quickly, have any of you heard of other practices where people are digging into how to do online instruction well? I'd imagine in places where schools close for snow days or frankly, hurricanes, flooding, whatever the climate is unleashing on us because we have not been good stewards of the planet. Are there folk out there who are doing good work and improving or thinking through how to improve online virtual instruction?
So one place I would recommend, I'm not doing a plug for a report of LPIs called Restarting and Reinventing Schools, but we do highlight some places that are doing distance learning, digital learning really well. And one of them is Miami-Dade County. And it's part of their instructional continuity plan. And so again, to your point, Kalila, about natural disasters or weather patterns where schools often have to shift in virtual and then in person. They also have an online curriculum that their teachers are well prepared in. So they provide extensive professional development so their teachers know how to seamlessly flow, depending on whether in person or entirely virtual. They also offer videos of expert teachers they call distance learning champions, who talk about their lessons and their approaches. And so a lot of it is just really planning for this. And the goal is that you're using that technology when students are back in school 100% so they can easily shift. The last thing that I'll mention is a number of high schools that do a lot of capstone projects or performance-based learning have made that shift easier because students are very self-directed. They know how to work independently, collaboratively, and the nature of the work that they're doing allows them that flexibility to use technology to either do it in person or at home.
Thank you, Jessica. I want to ask if either Sam or Neil have a burning remark for the end to share with our viewers.
My last thought and hope of, that I hope that there is a long-term effort to find those, districts, charters, schools that are doing things well, so that we can, get, productive learning, and that we can, the things that have gone well, I hope that they become more widely accessible opportunities for kids coming out of the pandemic. So how can, we better engage students? How can we use time more flexibly? How can we, make courses and opportunities available to, kids in small schools or in rural communities that may have, more limited offerings that the school is able to do on its own. And so, that is, a hope for, not a silver lining, but something that, there are places that are proving what may be possible, and that those opportunities become more widely available coming out of this.
Thanks so much, Neil. Sam Buckley, you will have the last word before we close out.
Agree with Neil, and I was going to say that I think that what I've taken from this pandemic is that I think the traditional schoolhouse does work for some of our students, but I think actually keeping that hybrid some virtual learning in place for those students who learn better that way is equally important. And I also think about just what I talked about in the beginning. I think this time, just as from an administrative perspective, it's really I was really able to show that human element to my staff. And I think that goes a long way, because I always tell people, when you take care of the adults in the building, they can take care of our kids. So that human element has been so important that, we do things as a staff. So whether we have staff social events, to help boost staff morale, but we let staff know that, hey, we're in this together, and that they know that we're not just out to get them. Like, we're all struggling, in this virtual platform together. So that human element has been probably the most important aspect of this whole pandemic virtual learning. And staff members know that, that we're in this together. But just like you had said earlier, I think that the social emotional learning piece, I think that collaboration with counselors and social workers and things like that is going to be so critical once we get back into school. And I was speaking with a colleague yesterday, I was thinking about, let's think about our ninth graders and our sixth graders who are, next year, it'll be their official first year back in the building. But then, technically speaking, we'll have two grades that are transitioning, into building. So you have ninth and 10th graders, and then you have sixth and seventh graders that they're transitioning into a building for the first time. So I think that we need to do a great job as administrators, all stakeholders, to make sure that transition is great for everyone.
Thanks so much, Sam. Thank you again to Shanae Bond, Neil Campbell, Jessica Cardashon, and Samuel Buckley. I want to encourage everyone viewing to visit www.webuildedu.org to hear stories from BIPOC educators, and to encourage elected officials to listen to those stories about how we can have a stronger recovery. Visit the Learning Policy Institute. They have a number of resources as it relates to recovery in the pandemic, as well as my team at the Center for American Progress. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, and we appreciate your time. Take care.